Hi everyone, I'm Laura Sherrod, the wildlife biologist for Lee and Fayette counties. Today I want to talk to you about goals and objectives for your wildlife management plan. If you're following along on your plan, this is part 4 on page 2. Determining your wildlife management goals and objectives is a very important step in this process. This is going to answer questions such as where we're going to go with this property and how do we get there. There's several things that we need to consider when we're trying to figure out our goals. We have to try to figure out what kind of wildlife that you're actually interested in, maybe what type of habitats or vegetative communities that you're interested in managing for. You also have to look at what you're working with. So you have to think about the size of your property, how much time, money, and effort you're able to devote into putting this plan into action. All of these can affect the goals and the objectives for your property. And so you could even have multiple goals and objectives for the same property. So for example, you might be interested in big bucks. Maybe you're interested in diversity of songbirds. Maybe you want to restore native prairie on your property. There might even be somebody out there that's interested in managing for feral hogs. However, none of us biologists are going to recommend that you do this, and you're actually going to be told no if you do turn this into the appraisal district. So the reason for that is because we're trying to manage for indigenous or native populations of animals. So that means we're not able to manage for these feral or exotic populations. So what is a wildlife management goal? Basically, it's just a broad statement of what you're trying to accomplish on your property. So goals cannot be quantified. They are all encompassing. And they're the whole reason that you're conducting these different activities on your property. So I have some examples of wildlife management goals. One would be to preserve resources for future generations. So remember, whenever we're talking about managing wildlife for tax valuation purposes, we're talking about managing these indigenous populations for human use. So anything that we're talking about with human use or enjoyment absolutely qualifies as a goal. So another example would be to enjoy the natural resources of Texas. Maybe you want to enhance the quality of hunting, fishing, and or outdoor recreation, or maintain and enhance the vitality and quality of the native habitats of Texas. I have a few more examples here. One could be to maintain a quiet place in the country where I can enjoy the native wildlife. Maybe you want to get a little bit more specific and do something like promote excellent habitat for trophy white-tailed deer viewing and harvest. Another good general goal would be to make sure my family and friends have a great place to hike, hunt, fish, wildlife watch, and overall enjoy being outside. It's also important to remember that we have to be realistic when we're trying to establish our goals. We have to think about the size of our property and what species we're going to be able to manage for. For example, if we have 15 acres of improved grassland like we see in this picture, it's not really feasible to support a breeding population of white-tailed deer, much less create this Boone and Crockett buck. So we have to think about what our size of property can support in the way of an indigenous breeding or wintering population. When we were putting together a plan for this workshop, we also had to figure out goals and objectives. So our goal for this workshop was to educate landowners and property managers on wildlife management and the wildlife tax valuation process. So basically everything that we're covering today in our workshop should meet this goal. All right, let's talk about wildlife management objectives now. So wildlife management objectives are just basically specific objectives that must be met to achieve our goals. So unlike the goals, our objectives can absolutely be quantifiable. They can be listed and checked off as we complete them. And they can be both long-term and short-term. So a few examples of our objectives could be to maintain a checklist of wintering birds. Maybe we're going to harvest bucks at mature age classes only. Maybe we want to plant food plots for mourning doves. Or maybe we're going to try to implement some sort of census on our property, such as conducting spotlight surveys for nocturnal mammals and reptiles. Just basically, we're going to get specific of how we're going to accomplish these goals. So I mentioned earlier that we had a goal of trying to educate you on wildlife tax valuation during this workshop. And so we do have certain objectives that we were looking at to meet that goal. So for example, we want to determine each of your landowner goals. We want to create some preliminary management objectives. We want to figure out what ecoregions all of your properties are in and maybe what type of habitat types you have on your property. We want to figure out what wildlife you guys are most interested in. We want to determine wildlife management practices most applicable to our participating properties. And we also want to figure out what wildlife surveys are best suited for your specific property. So once we determine your goals and objectives, you'll need to write a few sentences for your plan in that part 4. It doesn't have to be a 12-page paper or anything, but you will need to establish a clear, appropriate goal or goals, and then make sure to list your objectives for how you're going to accomplish that goal.